Where the Children Play by Robert B. Warren. Prologue. The youth ran through the forest. Sweat poured down his face. The breath rasped in his throat. His eyes strained to penetrate the twilight that hung like a curtain over the uneven terrain. Heavy cloud cover bolstered the darkness, rendering the numerous trails and pathways indistinguishable from one another. He scoured the landscape for recognizable landmarks, anything that might give him a sense of place, but they too lay hidden in shadow. The youth zigzagged past a cluster of bushes, then glanced over his shoulder. There was nothing behind him as far as he could tell. With luck, it would stay that way. He returned his attention to the path ahead, too late to avoid the obstruction that tripped him up and sent him tumbling to the ground. He wrestled to his feet, expecting to find a fallen log or tree stump. Instead, he discovered a deer rotting among the dirt, sticks, and fallen leaves. Moonlight slipped through a gap in the clouds, spilling across the carcass. The deer was bloated and swarming with maggots. Its tongue flopped from its mouth, and one of its antlers was broken. There was a long, gaping wound in its belly, as though the animal had been gutted. The youth covered his nose against the stench. He prayed his friend, David, had not met a similar fate. The two had entered the forest on a dare, to prove it was not as dangerous as everyone believed. They had been exploring for almost an hour when that thing came after them. They fled and quickly became separated. The youth could have kicked himself for coming here. His mother would do even worse. He could almost hear her scolding him. "What were you thinking?" she would yell. "I told you to stay out of the woods. I told you 1,000,000 times. That's it. I'm never letting you out of my sight again. I swear if your father was still here." The youth felt a sigh of icy breath against his nape. He whirled around and found only darkness. Trembling and panting, he scanned the immediate area. Nothing jumped out at him. He felt something close to relief, but knew better than to indulge in it. He would not be safe until he was back at home. The youth sidestepped the deer and resumed moving. He didn't get far before a rustling sound issued behind him. He looked back. The carcass had begun to move. What in the world? The youth thought. The deer continued to undulate as something large slowly crawled from the wound in its belly. The youth didn't wait to see what emerged and broke into a sprint. The twilight seemed to intensify as he ran, making it even harder to see the unearthed roots, logs, and embedded stones that threatened to trip him up. Up ahead, dense undergrowth impeded his path. Low-hanging branches snagged his charcoal sweater and denim jeans as he tore his way through, revealing a steep hillside. He hurried down the slope and came to an overgrown hiking trail at the bottom. It brought him to a picnic area. Dry rot had consumed the tables and benches, and kudzu blanketed the smashed remains of a brick barbecue. These were the first signs of civilization the youth had seen all night. That had to be a good thing, right? He was about to pass through when he heard a commotion in a neighboring treetop. Startled, he looked overhead and spotted an owl leaving its perch. Stupid bird, he thought. That instant, a chilled breeze rose behind him, hissing through the bushes and tossing fallen leaves. It smelled of putrefied meat, similar to the odor the deer gave off, but somehow worse. The youth looked behind him. Something stood on the trail. The surrounding shade obscured its true form, yet there could be no mistake. This was the same horror he and David encountered earlier. It had found him. The youth retreated through the picnic area, stumbling over debris hidden in the grass. By some miracle, he managed not to fall and reached the edge of the site, where a bridge stretched over a muddy creek bed. Fungal decay had rendered the wood slats soft and mushy. They bowed and whined beneath his footfalls, but mercifully remained intact. On the opposite shore, a narrow trail round through the undergrowth. The youth barreled forward. The wind strengthened, howling around him, smothering his ears, while the disgusting smell burned his lungs like molten tar. He dared to glance over his shoulder. There was nothing behind him, but he knew better than to believe his eyes. He did, however, trust his gut, and right now it told him to get out of the open, to find somewhere to hide. The path soon opened up into a campsite containing a moss-covered fire pit and a ragged nylon tent. Empty beer cans littered the ground. The youth hurried to the tent and pulled aside the entrance flap. The inside was empty, except for a torn-up sleeping bag and a broken oil lantern. He slipped inside, went as still as his shivering body would allow, and hoped his pursuer would pass him by. Tense minutes came and went. The wind roared, shaking the tent walls and slipping ice cold through small tears in the nylon. The youth heard something through the noise. A voice coming from outside. Faint at first, it became increasingly loud and familiar. "Help!" the voice shouted breathlessly. The youth peeked outside as David staggered into view. The heavy-set boy collapsed near the fire pit from apparent exhaustion, coughing and wheezing. He dragged himself up. His shirt rippled and ballooned in the wind. Leaves swirled furiously around him. "Help!" he repeated. "Someone!" The youth opened his mouth to call out, but a sudden intrusion forestalled him. A living shadow swept through the campsite, silent and impossibly fast. In a blur, it seized David and dragged him into the neighboring bushes. The youth scrambled to the back of the tent. Screams rang out. He covered his ears against them. The sounds bore through his hands, reverberating in his head. They lasted for what felt like hours before suddenly falling silent. Seconds passed with unusual slowness, like frost melting in the morning sun, and the rippling tent walls settled as the wind gradually died. The youth sat huddled into himself, shivering, cold mucus streaming from his nostrils. He listened for sounds of movement, but heard nothing. Not so much as a cricket chirped. Eventually, the youth mustered enough courage to move. The last thing he wanted was to leave the tent. But David could still be alive and desperate for help. He had to make sure. Slowly, carefully, he opened the entrance flap. The stench of rot rushed through. Then he saw it, mere inches from the tent, from his face, staring right at him. A scream ripped from the youth's lips. More followed. The last was clipped short by abrupt silence.